This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 207 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. My guest for today is Shaun Walker. Shaun worked as a reporter in Moscow for more than a decade, starting in 2007, first for The Independent and later for The Guardian. He now lives in Warsaw, Poland, where he is the Central and Eastern Europe correspondent for The Guardian and mostly covers the war in Ukraine. Besides his many articles for The Guardian and other media outlets, he's also the author of The Long Hangover, Putin's New Russia, and The Ghosts of the Past. I invited Shaun onto the podcast to discuss his newest book, The Illegals, Russia's Most Audacious Spies and Their Century-Long Mission to Infiltrate the West, which is available now. It's the story of decades of painstaking effort to select, train, and deploy a very small number of highly effective spies all across the world, and their successes and failures at infiltrating Russia's greatest adversaries for years at a time. By the way, if you're looking for a way to get friends and family as interested in history as you are, or if you want to learn something new and unexpected every month, then make sure to check out History by Mail. Every month, History by Mail will send you reproductions of famous and influential historical documents from American history. Accompanying the documents themselves are articles which put them in the context of their times and help you understand the impact they had on the course of American life. The topics are widely varied, so you're always learning something new, across themes that include historic conventions, American wars, and foreign diplomatic relations. I'm really enjoying my own subscription because it's opened my eyes to historic events I knew nothing about. You can subscribe for yourself or gift a subscription at historybymail.com for as little as $6.50 a month. Just click the link in the show notes of this episode and use the discount code Justin10 for a permanent 10% off your subscription. Shaun, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, absolutely. I've covered Soviet and Russian intelligence operations here on the podcast many times before, and I definitely recognize some names from your book, but I was really shocked at how many people and how many operations were brand new to me and how many details you managed to uncover about them. It seems like some pretty extraordinary research on your part. So, hats off to you for that.
Thanks very much. That's great to hear.
So I see clearly just from your biography that you are very well versed in current events and recent events in Russia and Eastern Europe. What was it that made you decide to go all the way back to Russian Revolution or perhaps even earlier for this book?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of been a series of rabbit holes that I've been going down for nearly a decade now. So the kind of first inspiration for the book was in the spring of 2016 when I managed to meet with the two children of a couple of illegals. They were a pair that had been arrested during the big roundup in 2010 in the US. So this was a couple that lived in Boston. They had two kids who were at the time 16 and 20, two sons, Tim and Alex. And apparently this was the first that Tim and Alex had any suspicion that they weren't just part of a normal Canadian-American family, was when the FBI came knocking on Tim's 20th birthday. And, for fans of the Americans, this was kind of the family that was loosely, their story was adapted into the TV series. So I sat down with these two young men who at the time were actually suing the Canadian government to get their passports back. And I was just really blown away by this extraordinary family story and what it means to kind of find out at that age that everything you thought about your parents was a lie, and what on earth was this program that really expected such long-term, intense living in a second skin from its operatives. So that was the starting point, and then I kind of went down, as I say, these different rabbit holes, trying to find out as much as I could about the program. And the conclusion that I came to was that not only was this kind of a series of really fascinating spy stories, but it also, at every step of the way, said something to me very interesting about Russia or the Soviet Union and the stage that it was at and its relations with the West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really is an extraordinary story what those kids went through totally unexpectedly. And what's even more interesting is that's not the first time that has happened. And, maybe it will happen again in the future, as a matter of fact. So some more than a few children out there have been just like absolutely traumatized by this late breaking news about the origins of their own families and their own identities, really, which is just amazing.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the themes I think that runs through even as the times change. I think that clearly with any kind of espionage, there is an element of deception, and often that even extends to people's families. If you meet former CIA people whose children don't know they were in the CIA, but here there's just something much more intense and visceral and kind of extraordinary, really, about this program. That indeed, that you can wake up one day and it turns out that both of your parents were not only Russian spies, but they were Russians, and you had no idea. That to me was, clearly this jumping off point for just what seemed to me to be like a fascinating kind of psychological dilemma to explore.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Was it difficult for you to uncover so much information? Because as I understand it, the KGB archives are still closed except for a couple of peeks behind the curtain that have happened over the years.
Yeah, I mean, clearly it's not easy. I mean, the KGB's archives are closed. Directorate S, which was the illegals directorate, is the kind of the most secretive of all of the KGB departments, if you like. But I kind of realized that there were some ways around this, and I've sort of combined my work as a journalist with some historical digging for different periods. So there were kind of several different sources that I used. The most obvious being interviews with a number of illegals, with their descendants, with people who knew them in one or other of their identities, and with the counterintelligence professionals in the West who were tracking them. Then there's a lot of, there's a surprising amount, particularly for the earlier periods of secondary literature, of memoirs, of weird little Russian books that were published in the early 90s in that brief window of freedom. And there aren't many copies out there, but when you can get hold of one, you see it's a bit of a treasure trove. I used, there was one of my illegals from the 1960s who was trained in Kiev, and I managed to get his training files from the Ukrainian archives. They still had thousands of pages of them, and they declassified them for me.
Wow.
And then the final source, which was, really perhaps the biggest of all, was the Mitrokhin archive, which, as I'm sure many of your listeners will know, was with these, this extraordinary story of this KGB archivist who spent years copying different files that he saw. He left Russia in 1992 with an MI6 kind of exfiltrated a whole bunch of his documents, and many of these documents relate to illegals. They're nothing quite like being able to see the full files. They're much less detailed. They're, of course, only copies, but still they give this extraordinary glimpse behind the curtain. And they can also, I could use them to verify things that people were telling me in interviews. And so that was probably the single biggest source for the Soviet period.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, it all, to me, at least, it all culminated in an incredible effort and incredible, like, comprehensive and cohesive narrative in your book. Just super, super readable history of the whole program, which I'm very excited to talk about. So I'd like to go all the way back to the beginning. Of course, that's the best place to start. In any case, can you tell me what was the first iteration of the illegals program? Like, how quickly after Bolsheviks took power did they start planning to send agents overseas in this manner?
So it happened really quickly. And, I go back even in the book, even to before the revolution, because I as I say, it just seemed at every stage to be this perfect reflection. And, the whole concept of the illegal and the undercover agent, I mean, it was inherent to the Bolshevik movement when they were a small revolutionary clandestine party. And so, Lenin himself devised these ideas of legals and illegals. The legals would be using their real names and taking advantage of all the things they could do openly. And the illegals would be the clandestine party. Many of them used disguises, some of them foreign disguises, some of them Russian disguises. Lenin himself would be disguised as a German or an Englishman, depending on the occasion. So this was sort of really part of their movement. And then when they take over in October 1917, and slowly start establishing this new Bolshevik state, which is surrounded by enemies, not many places recognize it diplomatically, so they can't send out diplomats or spies pretending to be diplomats. But what they do have is this extraordinary stable of passionate, worldly communists who are devoted to the cause. They've spent years living in the underground. Many of them are very used to, taking on different identities, changing their appearances. And so they repurpose all of this heritage of the underground as an intelligence service. And very soon by the early 1920s, you see them sending some of these operatives out initially to Western Europe, to the Balkans. And they basically have two goals, which is to infiltrate and penetrate and neutralize the kind of anti-Bolshevik white movement that is still very active all over the place in different capitals. And secondly, to find out, the traditional task of intelligence services, to find out what their adversaries are thinking, to get information, to try and get access to the diplomatic code messages and the kind of secret diplomacy of the time that the Soviet Union was excluded from.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It also seemed to me throughout the book that they were leaps and bounds ahead of their Western counterparts. And honestly, I mean, you didn't devote a whole lot of time to the Western illegals programs, but they almost seemed childlike in comparison to the Soviet program. What's the reason for that exactly? Just like they made it a national priority, or funding, or talent management, or what exactly?
So I think there's a number of reasons. I mean, the first one is exactly as I said. If you compare the Soviet regime in the 20s and 30s to, say, the US in the 20s and 30s, I mean, their contexts are just so different. You have in Moscow, you have this, as I say, this band of conspiracy-minded fanatics who have come through the underground and who are very aware that they have quite a tenuous state and they need to do everything they can to try to defend that state. And that's clearly not the case for the US, and it's really only in the Second World War that the Americans start thinking systematically about an intelligence service tool. There are other reasons as well. I mean, one of them being that, so if we sort of jump forward and look at the Cold War, and you might be alluding there to what I kind of briefly describe as the kind of only big CIA effort to use reverse illegals, and that comes in the late 1940s and early 1950s. They take Russian, Ukrainian emigres from prisoner of war camps in Germany. They train them in sort of what's been going on in the Soviet Union, and then they parachute them back into the Soviet Union. The idea is they'll be able to blend into society and send the CIA back information about what's happening inside the Soviet Union. So very, very similar to what the Soviets are doing in the West during the Cold War, kind of sleepers who also send back kind of political reports and some kind of basic intelligence about what's happening. But this is much, much more difficult for the CIA, even though they're not, they're dealing with native Russian speakers. So they don't have the hassle that the Soviet Union has of having to sort of train these people to learn a foreign language and pretend it's their native language. So they don't have that hurdle, but they do have the hurdle that the Soviet Union is a closed society. And so as soon as somebody parachutes in, I mean, do they have the right documents? This is a society that's quite paranoid about spies. Will they immediately stand out? And it turns out that most of them do, and they're very quickly apprehended. It was much easier, although it would get harder in the Cold War when, counterintelligence agencies did wake up, and the sort of, slipping across borders and operating at ease that happened in the 20s and 30s becomes much harder. But still, it's easier for the Soviets to infiltrate people into the West than it is for the West to infiltrate people into the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. Sure, certainly. So what would they look for in the ideal candidate for these illegal operations? They had to find a true diamond in the rough, is what it seemed like to me.
Yeah, so I mean, this also changes. So as I said, in those earliest periods, you're looking at people who already had a natural talent for this, and maybe already spoke many languages and were comfortable kind of moving around Europe. Most of those people end up being shot during the purges in the late 1930s under Stalin. And then during the Cold War, they sort of try to resurrect the program, but they don't have anymore these kind of passionate communists. So what they do instead is they look for, exactly as you say, this sort of rare combination of qualities that they think will make the perfect illegal. And so this is, it should be somebody, first of all, if we take the appearance, right, as so is so often the case with spies, it should be someone who has a pleasant appearance. So they look nice. It's nice to talk to them, but they shouldn't be too attractive or have too many distinguishing features. They shouldn't be incredibly tall or, have flaming red hair or anything that might stick in people's memory. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. Of course, they have to be very, very good at languages. They're one of the kind of mainstays of where the Soviets looked for their candidates was in the language faculties of top universities. They had to have the right temperament, and this would be tested by an incredibly elaborate and long range of tests before we even get to the training. And then finally, they had to be what the KGB would consider politically reliable. So there shouldn't be any dissident elements in their family. And they should be really patriotic and loyal to the cause, because this was a society that generally didn't let anybody out of sight. Very few people could travel. Those people that could travel were watched by the KGB when they're traveling. And here you have a program where you're sending people out, and by definition, they can't be watched because they can't have any contact with Soviet diplomats or anything like that. So they needed to be really, really sure that these people were going to be loyal, and that was part of the reason why the training program took so long.
Yeah, that was amazing to me, and I hadn't considered it before, but you made the point kind of later on in the book. I believe you said something like, at the time this was going on, there were roughly 290 million people in the Soviet Union, and out of all that 290 million, there were roughly 100 of these illegal agents, and they were the only Soviet citizens that could truly travel freely in the West without being watched, ideally, by anyone. And just what an extraordinary responsibility that is, but also a privilege. And the risk associated with that was really amazing. But just 100 people out of an entire country that have true freedom of movement in the West, that was really shocking to me.
Yeah, that was a sort of eureka moment that came as I was researching this, and I was suddenly thinking, it's really quite amazing when you think about it. And it also, and we might talk about this a bit later, but it also kind of made me realize why. So, with some of these later sleeper Cold War missions, and these people have been through this extraordinary training and they've put years of their life into this, and they're deployed, and 10 years later, they finally get in place. And then they end up doing quite banal things. And you think, well, what a waste of time. But actually, because when you look at it through the eyes of the Soviet system, it suddenly makes sense, because this is such a closed system that, the insights that you would get simply from being able to walk freely through New York City or through other places in the United States or Europe, these are things that no Soviet diplomat, no Soviet tourist, no Soviet sporting delegation, and these were the kind of categories of other people who could travel. None of them are going to see that. None of them are going to have those interactions because they're not allowed to. So the illegals really were this very, very privileged, in one sense, very small group of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they could just some of the insights they brought back just from walking around and interacting with Americans were extremely valuable, even if it wasn't anything classified. I seem to recall, I might be misremembering this because it's been a while, but I interviewed Jack Barsky back in 2021, I think, and it seems like one of his main responsibilities was to get a U.S. passport and then pass along the procedures for getting a passport, because they wanted him to be the first to get one, just figure it out on his own, so that they could teach additional illegals in the future how to do it, because nobody had really done it recently before he came in. Does that sound right to you? I know he was featured in your book.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he's kind of one of the examples I use of how it was seemingly so pointless. I mean, this is a guy who was a very promising, intelligent chemistry PhD student in East Germany. Had he not been recruited for the illegals program, he probably would have been a big shot professor. And here he is in New York, indeed, like getting a US passport successfully, but working for a long time as a bicycle delivery boy in New York City. Then he gets a sort of mid-ranking job in an insurance company. And you have to wonder, well, what's the point? And that was kind of, there isn't really one, except that because the Soviets have built this closed and paranoid system, in its own kind of perverted way, it has a logic to it that you do need someone like him being out there sending back this very basic information.
Yeah, there were some very, very serious obstacles they faced of all types, things that we probably wouldn't think of otherwise. So, Shaun, you mentioned a minute ago, you said something about 10 years later when they're deployed. Was it really like a 10-year training pipeline after an agent was selected for the program before they actually, moved to another country under an alias?
So it could be that long, and certainly until they moved into a place where they would be expecting to do active tasks. So often they would have something like a soft launch. So if their identity if their target was the US, they might initially go to Canada, much weaker counterintelligence environment. They would spend some time there before going to the US. If they had a German speaking identity, so they might spend a year or two in East Germany, where the local services wouldn't know who they were. But it did mean that if they failed, if they their cover wasn't convincing enough, they could be sort of quietly withdrawn and it wouldn't be a big scandal. But yeah, essentially, if I take the example of Yuri Linov, who's one of the characters I followed in quite a lot of detail through the 60s and 70s. So, I mean, he was recruited. He was first approached by the KGB as he was leaving school in I think 55, 56. They asked him if he might be interested. He said yes. They didn't say anything about illegals work at that time, but he went off to study German in Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine. And once a week after his studies, he would meet with two local KGB guys who would do all sorts of assessments on him. They would ask him to inform on his fellow students. They would get him drunk and see if how he behaved when he was drunk. They would have long conversations about Marxism, Leninism with him. And so after 5 years of study, when he graduates, they decide that he is potentially a candidate for the illegals program. They sent him to Kyiv, and there the full-time training starts. And that's another 3 years. You're never going into official KGB buildings. You are meeting in a series of safe houses, having one-on-one tuition for language, for political studies. It was eventually decided his cover was going to be Austrian, so he would have to sit and read through all of the years of Austrian textbooks that he would have studied had he been to school in Austria. Then he had a practice year in East Germany, as I mentioned. Then he had a short deployment in Austria where he actually got his passport. And by the time he was ready to, begin his real deployment, we're talking 67 or so. So this was, 7 years after he'd started the training program.
Wow. Incredible. And yeah, that was amazing. You devoted a huge portion of the book to his story, but it wows you just to read it because of the level of care that they went through with this guy and how he kind of rose to the occasion. I mean, he faced so many challenges in his training and then in his deployments and all that, and he overcame a lot of that because he really was a diamond in the rough in so many ways, it seemed like.
Yeah, and he was someone, I would say I featured him in such, so he's he's one out of the 5 big sections in the book, and I kind of tell his story from start to finish in one of them. And I chose him not because he was the most significant illegal in the history of the program, but just because his was a story that I could tell in that level of detail, because I spent he's still alive. I spent a long time interviewing him. And also he was the character I mentioned whose files I managed to get from Kyiv. So after spending hours hearing about this training procedure, I was able to read through in extreme detail all of these same things, but from the perspective of his trainers, and even some things where he hadn't quite realized what was happening at the time, and I could now see in the files what they were testing him for or what they wanted to do. So it was that, for me, that was, he was a great character to kind of really show this arc of an illegal life.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That was a fascinating insights from him, just page after page of insights. But it's funny what you just mentioned too, that even after all of this, even being essentially one of the most trusted people in the Soviet Union, he still often had no idea the consequences or the reasons behind anything that he was doing. He would sometimes be told, just go meet this person, go pick up this thing, send it back, look into this thing, and have no understanding of the larger picture because they didn't want him to.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, in some ways, this is kind of basic intelligence compartmentalization, right? The less people know, the less they can give away. I mean, the KGB took this to particularly obsessive levels. But yeah, so one of the things he had to do was to go and pick up a package from a dead drop in Naples and hand it over to a Soviet embassy employee, I think in Rome. That's all he knows is the location of the drop and the location where he'll meet the operative. He can't look in, obviously can't open the package. He suspects, I mean, there's a big American naval base in Naples. He suspects that the KGB have an agent on the inside, but he doesn't know. And that means that if he's caught, he can't give that away. It does also mean, of course, that when you're devoting so much of your life and psychological resources to this work, when you don't have this kind of sense of a bigger picture or a sense of what it is that you're working on, what you've achieved, what all of this sacrifice in your personal life has been for, this can kind of cause you to go a little bit mad. And I think you do see that with illegals at times where, right from the beginning, right until actually, there was a story recently in the New York Times about the Brazilian authorities busting a whole batch of, new in training illegals, and one was writing messages to the other like, what on earth is the point of this? Like, what have we done? Like, why are we wasting our lives in all these contortions? And what are we going to achieve? So on the one hand, it's sort of great tradecraft to not tell the operative anything. But on the other hand, you risk, I think, alienating these people who are kind of giving everything for the cause.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. That was actually going to be my next question is even after you find this diamond in the rough and even after you've trained them and equipped them so many ways, what kind of, mental pressure were they under and stress is, basically fake living a normal life every single day for year in and year out? I mean, how frequently did they kind of buckle under all of these pressures anyway?
Yeah, I mean, so this was something that was really interesting for me reading and really came through my interviews with people and reading the Mitrokhin archive, is how often these illegals faced kind of psychological crises, how often they, took to drink or defected or kind of, had massive mental breakdowns. And this, of course, is something that's not part of the kind of cult and myth of the illegal that's been built up in Russia under Vladimir Putin today. But it was very, very present all the way through. One thing that the KGB does to mitigate this is that starting in the early 1960s, it starts to send out illegals as couples. So it will, and contrary to the stereotype, not always, but usually they will try to, they won't just train two people separately and say like, you are now husband and wife, please travel abroad. Usually they will look for a pair that has a natural connection and is willing to work together. But of course, it also puts an enormous amount of stress on the relationship. So, Yuri, who we were just talking about, he sort of selects himself a bride from the Kyiv German language course at the Kyiv University. And he persuades her that, he's a great match. He's patriotic. He's on these important missions, but she doesn't really know what she's signing up for. They get married. She gets pregnant much too early. So if you get pregnant when you're already deployed abroad, then you can have a child in your cover. The child will have a genuine Western birth certificate. It's a fantastic addition to your cover. Right. If you have a child in the Soviet Union, you're screwed because you can't take it with you. You've got your own fake documents, but where does this child come from that you're appearing with in a new country? So she was told, well, that's very unfortunate that you've had a kid. We're going to have to leave that with your parents, and you will have to go. You'll also have to leave Yuri because he's further down the training program than you are. So you'll go off to East Germany for your practice year on your own without your 1-year-old daughter. And she's been sort of slightly tricked into this program
Mm-hmm.
and just finds it absolutely horrible. And I mean, to cut a long story short, essentially, quite soon into their deployment, Yuri just realizes that, she's nice, she's polite, she's worried about everything. It's all of the wrong qualities for what you need in this
Mm-hmm.
job. And so she's got to call back in disgrace. And he later works as a solo operative. But, the history of the illegals program is just littered with, there's cases where one illegal had to be dispatched to, I think, Sweden to kidnap another illegal who'd kind of gone a bit mad and they were worried was going to defect. There's cases of wives dragging husbands or husbands dragging wives into Soviet diplomatic missions saying, like, we need to be exfiltrated because, like, my partner's about to go mad and defect. There are cases of illegals who did defect. There are cases of illegals who drank themselves to death. So, this was really a program that the kind of happy success stories are few and far between.
Yeah, it does seem to grind up many of these people in so many ways, even like we said, despite them having these incredible talents and capabilities and training and everything. And I was extremely sympathetic towards Yuri's wife throughout the entire section of the book covering him, because she truly was dragged into it pretty much against her will. And it was funny to me, though. I think that he was basically ready to marry her within days of meeting her, wasn't he? I mean, not because he was falling in love, but because she just checked all the blocks on the checklist he had made up for a potential, cooperative, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, so he was sort of given a short list of 3 people in this German class and told, he went in posing as a German. He was, they were like, we've got a wonderful East German here today. He's going to talk to you all about life in East Germany. Of course, this was really the Russian Yuri Linov. And so Yuri chats to all this class in German, and he's been told, there are these 3 women that we've checked them. Their families are reliable. They're very, very good at the language. We think they could be suitable. And he picks Tamara, one of the students, and she initially wants nothing to do with it. I mean, she's like, I plan to do a PhD. I'm young. I don't have time for this nonsense. And he kind of, in this somewhat sinister way, with the kind of help of the KGB, essentially woos / manipulates her into marrying him. So I mean, they cook up a fake mission. So they tell her, the KGB approaches her after she's kind of told him to get lost a few times, and they've said, look, he's a very important operative. He's going to be trailing some enemy spies who are coming to the Soviet Union. They're going to be on a boat, and we need you to go on the boat with him. It's a cruise down the Dnipro River in Ukraine from Kiev to the Black Sea. And we need you to go with him and like root out these enemy spies. So she thinks, well, who am I to turn down this extraordinary mission to protect the motherland? So she goes along. And the whole thing turns out to be a setup. There's no enemy spies. There's just Soviet tourists. Her and Yuri are sharing a cabin. And, she feels like she's been kind of lured into this sort of weird sex trap. But, in time, she softens to him because, Yuri, like almost all the illegals, is a very, very charming man. I mean, being able to talk, be persuasive, be charming, that's a key part of what the KGB is looking for. So he kind of breaks her down. He charms her. He makes her laugh. He shows that he's a sort of serious chap with a, fascinating knowledge of German literature and who's about to go off and do this wonderful patriotic work abroad. And so she agrees, but she doesn't really know. It's never really spelled out to her what it's going to involve. She has the sort of vague idea that he'll be going off on missions and she'll be kind of raising the kids at home. And it's only quite late on in where she suddenly realizes that she's expected essentially to, dump her kids, dump her family, and go off abroad trying to be Christina Stolz, a German divorcee, and not Tamara Kovalenko, a Soviet PhD student.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just a very sad story overall. I guess the operation dictated that all of this had to happen, and they weren't really concerned about her wants and needs very much. And she, kind of did her best to go along, but it does seem like it was doomed from the start. no question.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of there's a theme running through this, and I wouldn't want to suggest that any spy agency is a sort of fluffy, cuddly bunnies devoted above all to the well-being of their operatives, but I think there is, particularly with the KGB, there's this sort of culture and historical legacy of martyrdom, of passionate devotion to the cause, of the kind of Marxist global revolution being inevitable and being way more important than any individual life. And it's just sort of expected that these kind of sacrifices, that's just something you have to do. And you see that right from the beginning until really quite recently.
Yeah, very understandable, a cultural lodestone there. So, Shaun, I want to talk to you about another one of the illegals from your book, who I believe was my personal favorite. Honestly, can you tell us a little bit about Iosif Grigulevich and his mission versus Tito from Yugoslavia, please? That was just extraordinary page turner out of your book, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, he's one of my favorites as well. So, and he's kind of the last. So he is in his heyday in the post-war years, but he's kind of the last one of those flamboyant early illegals who were on these outrageous missions before we get into the Cold War scenario of long, psychologically draining, lower key sleeper missions. So Iosif Grigulevich, he was born in what's now Lithuania. He was from an ethnic group that was partially Jewish, so he had this dark, shiny hair, dark eyes, and this would be very helpful for him because he would spend most of his career passing as a Latin American. And so after sort of bouncing around different places in South America where his father had emigrated, he picks up great Spanish. He starts working for Soviet intelligence during the Spanish Civil War. He actually pops up in 1940. Probably don't have time to get into it in detail, but he leads the first unsuccessful mission to try to kill Leon Trotsky in Mexico City. And even his co-conspirators and his team don't know who he is. They think that all they know is that he's a French Jew called Felipe. So he disappears from there. And again, it's kind of a long story, but it's at some point he's been in this way that in the 20s and 30s it was possible. He's switching identities all the time. He's, an American one day, an Argentinian the next day, Brazilian the next day. But he manages to get, at some point in the late 1940s, a great real fake passport when he's in Chile, and he meets in Chile a Costa Rican writer who he recruits as an agent. And together they cook up this plan that they're going to say that Iosif Grigulevich, he is the illegitimate son of a Costa Rican landowner. And, he was kicked out of Costa Rica as a child, and he's been wandering the world for years, but now the call of his homeland is upon him. His father's died. He wants to move back to Costa Rica. So they spin this tale to the consul general in Chile. The writer who Iosif has recruited kind of vouches for it. And he gets a genuine Costa Rican passport in the name of Teodoro Castro. So fast forward, he ends up back in Moscow in 1948, and they look at his options and they think the perfect place to deploy him will be to Rome, because Italy is one of the battlefields of the new Cold War that's just starting. The communists are on the ascendancy. The newly founded CIA is very active in Italy. So they send off Signor Teodoro Castro to Rome with his Mexican wife, who is now posing as an Argentinian. So we have two illegals and two fake identities. And they work together to sort of go around the diplomatic community in Rome. They make a lot of contacts. Of course, he poses as a successful businessman. Of course, the money comes from Moscow. And, he has this extraordinary break where the former prime minister of Costa Rica comes to visit Rome. And through all of the connections he's made, he manages to get them kind of all sorts of business meetings. He gets visiting Costa Ricans in to meet the Pope. And he's just become such a man about town that the Costa Ricans say, well, look, we don't actually have an ambassador in Rome. And this guy is such a fantastic patriot of Costa Rica. We should make him our ambassador. So it is
Incredible.
that Iosif Grigulevich, who has never once in his life set foot in Costa Rica, becomes the Costa Rican ambassador to Rome. And he's hosting these huge diplomatic parties. He's meeting all kinds of people. He has numerous meetings with the Pope, with the American ambassador, with all sorts of people that the sort of official Soviet diplomats would never be able to get anywhere near. And it's in 1953 that Stalin concocts a kind of extraordinary mission for him. So while being ambassador to Rome, Grigulevich he gets to know some Yugoslav diplomats, and it's suggested that it would be wonderful for Costa Rica and Yugoslavia to set up diplomatic relations, and he could also be the ambassador to Yugoslavia. Now, Yugoslavia has gone communist after the Second World War, but its leader, Josip Tito, he's basically Stalin's biggest headache in the communist bloc. He's leading Yugoslavia down a kind of independent communist path. He doesn't want to be subservient to Moscow. Stalin tried earlier a bunch of ways to kill him. It didn't work. He's purged all of the Stalinists in his entourage. And now here we are. Teodoro Castro, the Costa Rican ambassador, is in Belgrade. He's meeting with Tito. He's invited back for another audience to officially present his credentials. And this is the perfect opportunity that Soviet intelligence has been waiting for. So they concoct a sort of, extraordinarily audacious plan for you, Teodoro Castro, Iosif Grigulevich, to murder Tito. And they come up with a bunch of different ways they might do this. Like one is a sort of poisoned box of chocolates. One is that he would release plague dust into the air and everybody would die except for him, who would have been inoculated beforehand. But kind of in a probably for Grigulevich, probably quite a worrying admission that this was basically a suicide mission. He was meant to write a letter that he'd have on his person that would say the reason he'd done this was because he hates communists and he hates Tito because Tito's a communist. So trying to deflect attention from the real orderers of this hit. And so he goes back to Rome. He waits for the final approval, and probably rather luckily for him, just as this is about to be approved, Stalin dies and the whole thing is called off. He stays in Rome for about another 6 to 9 months, but he's then withdrawn back to Moscow. And he, for the next 35 years until he dies in 1988, he has a kind of weird second career where he becomes an academic writing about South America. And nobody among his colleagues knows that really he had spent many years posing as a South American and living as the Costa Rican ambassador to Rome. Costa Ricans also wondered what on earth had happened to their ambassador, who simply disappeared one day in 1953. And it was only in 1990, when some of the archives started becoming public, that they realized, like, aha, I guess that's what happened to Ambassador Teodoro Castro.
Absolutely incredible. What a story that guy had. Just astonishing, honestly. And you have that photo in the book, of course, of Tito and the man he thinks is Teodoro Castro meeting. And it's amazing to look at it in hindsight and realize that Castro / Grigulevich was supposed to be essentially like wearing a plague bomb to that meeting. And nobody knew or anything. Just absolutely incredible that photo even exists. So love that story. And one of the few guys that seems to have made like a clean break from the illegals trade and then, moving on to something else later in life. Just incredible finesse there, honestly. Yeah. Fascinating stuff. So, Shaun, we've talked a lot about Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and you mentioned inserting agents into Canada. So I take it then that actually getting illegals established in the United States was very, very difficult. Is that correct?
So it becomes harder after the Second World War, for sure. I mean, one of the advantages of the United States, of course, is that it's particularly earlier on, and particularly if you're talking about the big cities, is that this is a nation of immigrants, that,
Exactly.
one more person with a slightly strange accent and a slightly weird origin story won't necessarily raise suspicions. But whereas some of the earlier illegals in the kind of 30s and even during the Second World War could operate in the United States without too much worry, of course, once the Cold War starts, we have, huge investment into the FBI, you have McCarthyism, you have everyone on the lookout for Reds, and this work does become much harder. At the same time, the US becomes what the KGB call the main enemy. It becomes the absolute number one target. And although illegals continue to work around the world, they are often given the task to look for Americans, to look for people who might have connections with Americans. So, something Yuri told me that his trainers asked him when he would be traveling around Europe was that you would have a 20-minute conversation with someone you would meet, and you would work out during that 20 minutes, are they a useful source, or are they what the KGB called ballast? And if they were ballast, you should discard them immediately. But if they were useful, they might have a relative in the US, they might have some connections in the US, they might have suggestions about moving to the US. So there was always this maneuvering as to what might be possible and how it might be possible to infiltrate people into the US. But indeed, the reality turned out to be much harder. And you see, there were for sure cases of successful deployments to the US during the Cold War, but I think it's in either 1967 or 69, but they come up with a plan that by 1975, there should be 10 what they would call illegal residencies. So, main illegal communications people, basically 10 parallel networks operating in different parts of the United States. By the time 1975 comes around, they have just one active illegal in the US, as far as we know. And that's kind of, I think, a reflection of how difficult it was, despite all of the effort and money that was going into this, to kind of place these long-term missions successfully.
That was very surprising to me, honestly, because I felt like in so many ways, just from my own readings, the KGB kind of ate our lunch. Throughout the Cold War. They're so good at this game. And like you said, us being a nation of immigrants and just generally welcoming, another Eastern European refugee, quote unquote, something like that, I thought would be relatively easy to place, but clearly that was not the case at all. So what was it that, kind of separated the US from some of the other things that they tried? Was it like just the FBI being extra vigilant by that time period or something else?
I think, so a lot of the failures in this period in the 60s and so on came down to those psychological pressures that we were talking about before. So the people did make it there, they were undetected, but then, they fell in love, or they got drunk, or they couldn't cope with it and they wanted to defect. So, probably the most famous Cold War illegal, Rudolf Abel, who was tried in New York in, I want to say, the late 50s, he was busted because another illegal who had a drinking problem went to the Americans and told them everything. And in the courtroom, you actually had this illegal, Heichanen, standing off against Rudolf Abel, giving evidence against him. So partly it was just, as we talked about, this kind of difficulties of the program. Partly also it was the KGB's unwillingness to adapt. And, you mentioned there Eastern European immigrants. And one really telling and fascinating story for me was the story of Karl Kircher, who was a Czech illegal of sorts. And the Czechs, so they were obviously part of the Soviet bloc, and the kind of KGB rather patronizingly took the services in places like Czechoslovakia under their wing, and they jointly ran some programs and kind of shared the intelligence. But the Czechs came up with the obvious idea that, like, why do we need to spend 5 years training a Czech to pose as a German or a Canadian or whatever, sending them into the West with no valid Western educational qualifications. So we want them to get close to political decision makers, but they don't have a degree. So usually the only jobs that are open to them are blue collar jobs. So they said, well, hang on, there's an obvious solution
Right.
to this. We can send people as defectors, and we can send these people with their real names, their real identities, their real educational background. But instead of saying we're, admitting to they're passionate communists, they'll say, we despise everything about the communist life. We want to defect. We want a new life in the West. And Karl Kircher, and his wife, who did this, he actually got a job as a translator for the CIA after a number of years. So you have somebody, using a much, much simpler scheme, achieving a lot more. But in general, rather than, listen to what the Czechs were suggesting, that this might be a rather easier way of doing things, the KGB kind of stuck with the traditional program where you train people for years on end to pose as foreigners. And this was increasingly difficult, time-consuming, and as we see in a lot of cases, it just didn't work.
Right. It was, fraught with difficulties and risks and all of that, certainly. Did they continue to pursue it just kind of doggedly and in the face of the evidence, or was it still, despite all these difficulties, was it like a good return on their money in the end, do you think?
I mean, this is the sort of, billion-dollar question with this book and with this program. My feeling researching the book is that at so many points, so I think the initial illegals program was brilliant. It was a brilliant response to a very pressing and real challenge, and they used the resources they had, and they had a lot of successes. But there's a number of points where you kind of feel like, okay, this is probably the logical end to this program. So one of them is after the purges, when the most talented operatives are killed. Another one is at the end of the Cold War, when Russia becomes independent and the KGB is disbanded. Another one is 2010, when there's this big roundup in the US, and you sort of feel, okay, well, finally now this kind of Cold War program, that's really the end. And then they come back again. And each of these cases, it kind of comes back. And I mean, I think that there is a sort of, this is such the way that I kind of conclude at the end of the book is with a quote from a Western counterintelligence officer who said that, gave this sort of double response, which I've heard quite a number of times when it comes to illegals, which is, first of all, we'll say this is a waste of time. It's outdated. It's pointless. We can't believe they're still putting all this money into this, like totally ridiculous. And then they'll kind of pause and say, but, it would only take one of them to be undetected in a sensitive place, and then they're the most dangerous thing imaginable. So there's this kind of sense all the way through, I mean, in the Cold War and right up to the modern day, that this is a kind of outdated form of spying, but there's so much romance and mystique and mysteriousness to it, and it's so uniquely Russian that nobody's ever quite sure that they can write it off completely.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. And to me, that's so true of so many aspects of espionage history, is there's always something else that is simply not known publicly, and perhaps that changes the equation for them entirely, and we just are not aware of it, as reporter or historian or whatever have you. But yeah, it does seem like just the evidence does not point to a huge amount of success. Are you aware of any illegals who ultimately wound up with access to a lot of extremely valuable and timely classified information? I mean, you mentioned Kocher, but he was Czech. He was not Russian, as you said. So did any of them wind up in a high position that as far as you know?
So I think once you start saying goodbye to the characters from the 1920s and 30s who were really kind of walking out of Western embassies with suitcases full of documents, and Iosif Grigulevich, who we discussed, who was making himself ambassador, it does start to look a lot less impressive. Part of the whole idea of the Cold War program was that in many cases, their missions were not to be getting into high places and to be stealing documents from the president's desk. Their missions were to be laying low, and that in the event that the Cold War turns hot, there would then be this network of sleepers. I do think, as I would totally accept what you say, that there's also, as always with intelligence, there can be a kind of failure bias. I mean, we know about the failures,
right?
We know about the defectors. We know about the people who frustratedly wrote books that they wasted their whole lives on this. And, who knows what secrets there are in the archives. I mean, the counterpoint to that is that, one is the Matrokin archive kind of there's a pretty decent summary in there, and what we tend to see is much less success than you might think.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing is that just the Russian state is so obsessed about illegals now and promoting them and promoting their achievements. And it's usually done in quite vague terms. But my sense would be that if there was some like really extraordinary things that they'd managed to do that we just haven't slipped out yet, we might know about them. And I appreciate it's, it might sound strange to your listeners because I feel like, most spy books, it's, the $1 billion spy or the spy who changed history or the world's most important spy. And I'm here kind of trying to promote my book by telling you that none of them achieved anything. But for me, this was actually what was so interesting about the story, that it really did reflect what the Soviet Union was like. So, you go from this utopianist, messianic, brave, and slightly crazy paranoid state in the 20s and 30s, and the spying reflects it. And by the time you get to the 70s, you have this kind of paranoid, ossifying bureaucracy that's still trying to talk in the language of revolution and dynamism, but is sort of copying the past without any real enthusiasm. And you see the same thing in the illegals program. And I think it's no coincidence that actually one of the things I should have mentioned when you asked about successes, that probably the place that the illegals program is most successful in the 70s and 80s is in sniffing out dissidents inside the Soviet bloc. So, the KGB is sending its illegals disguised as Westerners. For example, in 1968, when the Prague Spring happens and there's this big reform movement in Prague, and there's a real threat to the socialist order there. And so out of nowhere, 15 foreigners appear who are all very sympathetic to the leading lights of the Prague Spring. They want to get to know them. They want to know about their plans. They hint that maybe they have some links with Western intelligence and could help fund them. And all of these people are actually Soviet illegals. And the reports that they send back to the KGB help the Soviets to crush the Prague Spring. And then these kind of missions into the Soviet bloc go on until the collapse. So for me, that was, again, what a reflection of changing priorities, that this program that you set up as a kind of brilliant offensive weapon against capitalist enemies, it turns out that its most effective use by the time we get to the 70s and 80s is in sort of sniffing out dissent inside the Soviet bloc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was another extraordinary portion of the book that we hadn't really covered yet, but it was sort of like a rapid mass deployment of illegals, which seemed kind of antithetical to everything that had come before it, but it also worked out pretty well from the Soviet perspective at that time. So, and you're saying that they adopted that and continued to use that model in later years as well after the Prague Spring?
Yeah, they used that all through the 70s and 80s. They even start in the 80s using it inside the Soviet Union. So, for example, there's a little snippet in the Mitrokhin documents where they approach, I think it's in the early 1980s, but they approach a bunch of Soviet Jewish leaders using illegals. And the illegals basically go up to them and say, I work for the CIA and I'd like to recruit you. They're posing as, an American businessman or whatever. Mm-hmm. And this is a way of testing the loyalty, making sure do these people really, are they loyal to the Soviet Union, or might they be open to these approaches? So again, just this really kind of sinister use of these operatives at home, which was not what they thought they'd be doing when they signed up for this. And again, it's something that's been completely written out of today's telling under Putin, of these sort of swashbuckling operatives who go off to steal secrets from the West.
Yeah, really just extraordinary stuff. So do you think that right now, like in 2025, do you think the Russian government is still fully committed to some iteration of the illegals program, or have they kind of moved on at this point?
I mean, as crazy as it might seem, I think they are. They really are. As I said, I think my working assumption for a few years, when I started out on this book in 2016, my working assumption was that the 2010, the bust in 2010 came about because the Americans had recruited a very, very senior figure in the illegals program, Alexander Poteyev, and Poteyev defected. He was exfiltrated just before all these illegals were arrested, and basically gave the Americans, everything about the illegals program. So that was the end, we thought. And yet what we now see, so since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, there's been 6 or 7 illegals that have been busted in different places. We now know another 8 or 9 that were in the very early stages of documentation in Brazil. So this is still something that the Russians are doing. And, remarkably, still something they're doing in the same way. What I would say that's interesting. So if you'd have asked me, why are they doing this? What is the point? If you'd have asked me this 5 years ago, I would have said that I have no answer at all. I mean, I do not know. The whole point of badging people as foreigners in the Soviet period was that Soviet citizens couldn't travel. So there was no such thing as a Soviet traveling salesman or a Soviet business consultant, in the same way that the CIA could use these people under non-official cover. The minute you started talking to somebody who introduced themselves as a Soviet businessman in a New York cocktail party, you would assume that they're a spy. So they had to use foreigners. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, this, of course, wasn't the case. There were hundreds of thousands of Russian scientists, sports people, artists, actors, or you name it, traveling across the world. And so, of course, it was, and of course, 99.999% of them had no links at all to the intelligence services. So very easy to slip in some that do. Why do you need to spend 6 years training them to be an Argentinian? Just make them a Russian business person. And I mean, I think that still largely holds true. But what's interesting, I think now, after the invasion of Ukraine, after the fact that Russia has again become a bit of a pariah, it's under sanctions, there's no easy flights into Moscow, diplomats have been kicked out of the embassies across Europe. Suddenly, this idea of the illegal is again kind of appealing, because for many people, sharing information with someone who they, a curious Russian, they might start to think people are again kind of on the lookout for Russian spies, Russian espionage. Whereas if you are talking to an Argentinian art gallery owner, as was the cover identity of an illegal arrested in Slovenia in 2022, unless you're a very suspicious person, you're probably not going to think that you're dealing with a Russian intelligence operative. And indeed, multiple people who I spoke to in Slovenia after their arrest, who had known this woman and her husband, were absolutely adamant that there was no possible way these people could be Russian spies. They were very normal, nice, upstanding Argentinians. I think they had those beliefs dispelled when they saw their friend Maria walking down the steps of a plane after a prisoner exchange and being greeted by Vladimir Putin. But yeah, so sorry, a long and meandering answer, but essentially it's, I would just say, I think that we are again at a moment where everything Russian is somehow suspicious. Therefore, the concept of the illegals program, where you disguise all your links to Russia, again becomes useful.
Yeah, extraordinary. And, it's fascinating, but I do anticipate if they continue the program, there's going to be more arrests worldwide in the future, I have to say. It does seem like a very tough nut to crack, even after decades and decades of trying and learning and adapting.
Yeah.
Wow. So, Shaun, this is an extraordinary book. I absolutely loved it, and it feels like just a real accomplishment, honestly, to bring so many of these stories to light. So, for the listeners out there, I can't recommend this book enough. It's called The Illegals: Russia's Most Audacious Spies and Their Century-Long Mission to Infiltrate the West, by Shaun Walker. So, we'll put a link in the show notes of this episode if you want to pick it up. Super readable narrative, and honestly, we've covered maybe a third of the book in this interview, so lots more stories that you've never heard anywhere else, I can assure you. Shaun, what are you doing now that the book has been published? Have you got another book that you're working on already?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I've sort of slightly fallen into this intelligence world through the kind of contacts I made on this book. So I've got another idea that's also to do with Russian intelligence, a little bit more contemporary. But yeah, watch this space.
Okay. You're being very cagey, which most of my guests are. I understand that totally, but I'm very much looking forward to it. Do you anticipate it will be out like in a couple of years from now, maybe, or is it just a concept at the moment, or what?
I mean, I certainly hope it's not going to take me 8 years of work as the illegals did. I'm going to try and work on a slightly quicker timeline this time for sure.
Okay, great. Well, I look forward to whatever else you publish in the future. Definitely. I really appreciate it. Do you have any like social media sites or website or anything like that you'd like to share with the listeners if they want to follow along?
Well, I've slightly I'm on X, Shaun Walker 7. I slightly stopped using it since the
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying
of that answer several times. Yes,
but yeah. So otherwise, I write quite a lot about intelligence in the Guardian. I just did a story about the Russians kind of using Ukrainian teenagers as unwitting suicide bombers inside Ukraine. So you can follow my journalism